Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English. We turn now in our final two titles in Unit number 6 to the comparing of tall tale and myth. We have in Unit 6, of course, been dealing a lot with this notion of the oral tradition and epic poetry and all of that. Your textbook company has paired now two titles together. The first of these two, Pecos Bill, is the one that we'll be dealing with now. You should have your hymnals open to 12:16, 12:17. We'll introduce ourselves to Harold Felton in a bit, and the Pecos Bill, the Cyclone text, he'll be the author for. But the first thing we want to say is, let's get a distinction in your notes at 2B out of the way. The difference between tall tale and myth. I hope you're reading with me on 12:16 really quickly. A tall tale is a type of folk tale that's characterized by, you want to write this down at 2B, hyperbole or overstatement, exaggeration, hyperbole. If something is hyperbolic, if it's somebody were to say, "I'm so hungry I could eat an elephant," well, this is hyperbole. It's exaggeration, just a way to say we're hungry, right? Tall tales, to continue, usually contain larger-than-life heroes, far-fetched situations, amazing feats, and a great deal of humor. By the way, that's what makes often tall tales different from, for example, epic myths. Tall tales are a kind of legend, a traditional story about the past that's often based on historical fact. Many tall tales come from the American frontier and reflect the ideas of that period. The purpose of a tall tale is to entertain readers and audience. Now juxtapose that, in your notes at 2B, to a myth, an ancient story intended to explain the actions of gods or human heroes, reasons for certain traditions, causes of natural features and events. Every culture has its own collection of myths or mythology. Originally religious in nature, myths often express the central values of the people who created them. Mythic heroes often have at least one divine parent, gain special knowledge or weapons, face seemingly impossible tasks. On the other hand, heroes of tall tales are not divine. They are outsized human characters who perform amazing feats through their great size, strength, cleverness, sheer force of will. In general, just to continue and finish now, tall tales describe how humans make things happen on their own, while myths tell how gods shape human life. Both these forms, however, have roots in the oral tradition, express the values of the historical period in which they developed. Let's jump over the page to 12:17, introduce ourselves to Harold W. Felton, 1902 to 1991. You can see the dates there. Practiced law, worked for the Internal Revenue Service over the years. He became increasingly interested in the legends and folklore of the United States. He published a collection of these stories about folk heroes and cowboys of the West. His book, Legends of Paul Bunyan, contains more than 100 folk tales about the great logger. Let's turn now to 12:18. Now, we're going to get in Pecos Bill, the Cyclone, a tall tale about a fictional cowboy who tames an angry cyclone. It's interesting to me the number of freshmen who say, "Oh, I heard this story once when I was a little kid. I just never knew actually where it came from." We'll go ahead now and do the reading of this text. And as we go through the reading of this text, let's ask this question at 2B. Where is the humor? What is funny or interestingly funny about this story? All right, let's pay attention now. Pecos Bill and the Cyclone.
Pecos Bill, the Cyclone, by Harold W. Felton. One of Bill's greatest feats, if not the greatest feat of all time, occurred unexpectedly one 4th of July. He had invented the 4th of July some years before. It was a great day for the cowpunchers. They had taken to it right off like the real Americans they were. But the celebration had always ended on a dismal note. Somehow, it seemed to be spoiled by a cyclone.
12:19.
Bill had never minded the cyclone much. The truth is, he rather liked it. But the other celebrants ran into caves for safety. He invented cyclone cellars for them. He even named the cellars. He called them frayed holes. Pecos wouldn't even say the word afraid. The cyclone was something like he was. It was big and strong too. He always stood by, musing pleasantly as he watched it. The cyclone caused Bill some trouble, though. Usually it would destroy a few hundred miles of fence by blowing the post holes away. But it wasn't much trouble for him to fix it. All he had to do was to go and get the post holes and then take them back and put the fence posts in them. The holes were rarely ever blown more than 20 or 30 miles. In one respect, Bill even welcomed the cyclone, for it blew so hard it blew the earth away from his wells. The first time this happened, he thought the wells would be a total loss. There they were, sticking up several hundred feet out of the ground. As wells, they were useless. But he found he could cut them up into lengths and sell them for post holes to farmers in Iowa and Nebraska. It was very profitable, especially after he invented a special post hole saw to cut them with. He didn't use that type of post hole himself. He got the prairie dogs to dig his for him. He simply caught a few gross of prairie dogs and set them down at proper intervals. The prairie dog would dig a hole. Then Bill would put a post in it. The prairie dog would get disgusted and go down the row ahead of the others and dig another hole. Bill fenced all of Texas and parts of New Mexico and Arizona in this manner. He took a few contracts and fenced most of the southern Pacific right-of-way too. That's the reason it is so crooked. He had trouble getting the prairie dogs to run a straight fence. As for his wells, the badgers dug them. The system was the same as with the prairie dogs. The labor was cheap, so it didn't make much difference if the cyclone did spoil some of the wells. The badgers were digging all of the time anyway. They didn't seem to care whether they dug wells or just badger holes. One year, he tried shipping the prairie dog holes up north, too, for post holes. It was not successful. They didn't keep in storage, and they couldn't stand the handling in shipping. After they were installed, they seemed to wear out quickly. Bill always thought the difference in climate had something to do with it. It should be said, in those days, there was only one cyclone. It was the first and original cyclone, bigger and more terrible by far than the small cyclones of today. It usually stayed by itself up north around Kansas and Oklahoma and didn't bother anyone much. But it was attracted by the noise of the 4th of July celebration and without fail managed to put in an appearance before the close of the day. On this particular 4th of July, the celebration had gone off fine. The speeches were loud and long. The contests and games were hard fought. The high point of the day was Bill's exhibition with Widowmaker, which came right after he showed off Scat and Rat. People seemed never to tire of seeing them in action. The mountain lion was almost useless as a work animal after his accident, and the snake had grown old and somewhat infirm, and was troubled with rheumatism in his rattles. But they too enjoyed the 4th of July and liked to make a public appearance. They relived the old days. Widowmaker had put on a good show, bucking as no ordinary horse could ever buck. Then Bill undertook to show the gaits he had taught the Palomino. Other Mustangs at that time had only 2 gaits, walking and running. Only Widowmaker could pace. But now Bill had developed and taught him other gaits, 27 in all, 23 forward and 3 reverse. He was very proud of the achievement. He showed off the slow gaits, and the crowd was eager for more. He showed the walk, trot, canter, lope, jog, slow rack, fast rack, single foot, pace, stepping pace, foxtrot, running walk, and the others now known. Both men and horses confuse the various gaits nowadays. Some of the gaits are now thought to be the same, such as the rack and the single foot. But with Widowmaker and Pecos Bill, each one was different. Each was precise and to be distinguished from the others. No one had ever imagined such a thing. Then, the cyclone came. All of the people except Bill ran into the frayed holes. Bill was annoyed. He stopped the performance. The remaining gaits were not shown. From that day to this, horses have used no more than the gaits Widowmaker exhibited that day. It is unfortunate that the really fast gaits were not shown, If they were, horses might be much faster today than they are. Bill glanced up at the cyclone, and the quiet smile on his face faded into a frown. He saw the cyclone was angry, very, very angry indeed.
1221.
The cyclone had always been the center of attention. Everywhere it went, people would look up in wonder, fear, and amazement. It had been the undisputed master of the country. It had observed Bill's rapid climb to fame and had seen the 4th of July celebration grow. It had been keeping an eye on things all right. In the beginning, the 4th of July crowd had aroused its curiosity. It liked nothing more than to show its superiority and power by breaking the crowd up sometime during the day. But every year, the crowd was larger. This preyed on the cyclone's mind. This year, it did not come to watch. It deliberately came to spoil the celebration. Jealous of Bill and of his success, it resolved to do away with the whole institution of the 4th of July once and for all. So much havoc and destruction would be wrought that there would never be another Independence Day celebration. On that day in future years, it would circle around the horizon, leering and gloating. Well, at least, so it thought. The cyclone was resolved also to do away with this bold fellow who did not hold it in awe and run for the frayed hole at its approach. For untold years it had been the most powerful thing in the land, and now here was a mere man who threatened its position. More, who had usurped its position. When Bill looked at the horizon and saw the cyclone coming, he recognized the anger and rage. While a cyclone does not often smile, Bill had felt from the beginning that it was just a grouchy fellow who never had a pleasant word for anyone. But now, instead of merely an unpleasant character, Bill saw all the viciousness of which an angry cyclone is capable. He had no way of knowing that the cyclone saw its kingship tottering and was determined to stop this man who threatened its supremacy. But Bill understood the violence of the onslaught even as the monster came into view. He knew he must meet it. The center of the cyclone was larger than ever before. The fact is, the cyclone had been training for this fight all winter and spring. It was in best form and at top weight. It headed straight for Bill, intent on his destruction. In an instant, it was upon him. Bill had sat quietly and silently on the great pacing Mustang, but his mind was working rapidly. In the split second between his first sight of the monster and the time for action, he had made his plans. Pecos Bill was ready and waiting. Green clouds were dripping from the cyclone's jaws. Lightning flashed from its eyes as it swept down upon him. Its plan was to envelop Bill in one mighty grasp. Just as it was upon him, Bill turned Widowmaker to its left. This was a clever move, for the cyclone was right-handed, and while it had been training hard to get its left in shape, that was not its best side. Bill gave rein to his mount. Widowmaker wheeled and turned on a dime, which Pecos had with great foresight and accuracy thrown to the ground to mark the exact spot for this maneuver. It was the first time that anyone had thought of turning on a dime. Then he urged the great horse forward. The cyclone, filled with surprise, lost its balance and rushed forward at an increased speed. It went so fast that it met itself coming back. This confused the cyclone, but it did not confuse Pecos Bill. He had expected that to happen. Widowmaker went into his 21st gait and edged up close to the whirlwind. Soon they were running neck and neck. At the proper instant, Bill grabbed the cyclone's ears, kicked himself free of the stirrups, and pulled himself lightly on its back. Bill never used spurs on Widowmaker. Sometimes he wore them for show and because he liked the jingling sound they made. They made a nice accompaniment for his cowboy songs. But he had not been singing, so he had no spurs. He did not have his rattlesnake for a quirt. Of course, there was no bridle. It was man against monster. There he was, Pecos Bill astride a raging cyclone, slick-heeled and without a saddle. The cyclone was taken by surprise at this sudden turn of events, but it was undaunted. It was sure of itself. Months of training had given it a conviction that it was invincible. With a mighty heave, it twisted to its full height. Then it fell back suddenly, twisting and turning violently, so that before it came back to earth, it had turned around 1,000 times. Surely no rider could ever withstand such an attack. No rider ever had. Little wonder. No one had ever ridden a cyclone before. But Pecos Bill did. He fanned the tornado's ears with his hat and dug his heels into the demon's flanks and yelled, "Yippee!" The people who had run for shelter began to come out. The audience further enraged the cyclone. It was bad enough to be disgraced by having a man astride it. It was unbearable not to have thrown him. To have all the people see the failure was too much. It got down flat on the ground and rolled over and over. Bill retained his seat throughout this ruse. Evidence of this desperate but futile stratagem remains today. The Great Staked Plains, or as the Mexicans call it, Llano Estacado, is the result.
1223.
Its small, rugged mountains were covered with trees at the time. The rolling of the cyclone destroyed the mountains, the trees, and almost everything else in the area. The destruction was so complete that part of the country is flat and treeless to this day. When the settlers came, there were no landmarks to guide them across the vast, unmarked space, so they drove stakes in the ground to mark the trails. That is the reason it is called Staked Plains. Here is an example of the proof of the events of history by careful and painstaking research. It is also an example of how seemingly inexplicable geographical facts can be explained. It was far more dangerous for the rider when the cyclone shot straight up to the sky. Once there, the twister tried the same thing it had tried on the ground. It rolled on the sky. It was no use. Bill could not be unseated. He kept his place, and he didn't have a skyhook with him either. As for Bill, he was having the time of his life, shouting at the top of his voice, kicking his opponent in the ribs, and jabbing his thumb in its flanks. It responded and went on a wild bucking rampage over the entire West. It used all the bucking tricks known to the wildest broncos as well as those known only to cyclones. The wind howled furiously and beat against the fearless rider. The rain poured. The lightning flashed around his ears. The fight went on and on. Bill enjoyed himself immensely. In spite of the elements, he easily kept his place. The raging cyclone saw this out of the corner of its eye. It knew then who the victor was. It was twisting far above the Rocky Mountains when the awful truth came to it. In a horrible heave, it disintegrated. Small pieces of cyclone flew in all directions. Bill still kept his seat on the main central portion until that rained out from under him. Then he jumped to a nearby streak of lightning and slid down it toward Earth. But it was raining so hard that the rain put out the lightning. When it fizzled out from under him, Bill dropped the rest of the way. He lit in what is now called Death Valley. He hit quite hard, as is apparent from the fact that he so compressed the place that it is still 276 feet below sea level. The Grand Canyon was washed out by the rain, though it must be understood that this happened after Paul Bunyan had given it a good start by carelessly dragging his axe behind him when he went west a short time before. The cyclones and the hurricanes and the tornadoes nowadays are the small pieces that broke off of the big cyclone Pecos Bill Road. In fact, the rainstorms of the present day came into being in the same way. There are always skeptics But even they will recognize the logic of
12:24.
the proof of this event. They will recall that even now, it almost always rains on the 4th of July. That is because the rainstorms of today still retain some of the characteristics of the giant cyclone that met its comeuppance at the hands of Pecos Bill. Bill lay where he landed and looked up at the sky, but he could see no sign of the cyclone. Then he laughed softly as he felt the warm sand of Death Valley on his back. It was a rough ride, though, and Bill had resisted unusual tensions and pressures. When he got on the cyclone, he had a $20 gold piece and a Bowie knife in his pocket. The tremendous force of the cyclone was such that when he finished the ride, he found that his pocket contained a plugged nickel and a little pearl-handled penknife. His 2 giant 6-shooters were compressed and transformed into a small water pistol and a pop gun. It is a strange circumstance that lesser men have monuments raised in their honor. Death Valley is Bill's monument, sort of a monument in reverse, sunk in his honor, you might say. Perhaps that is as it should be. After all, Bill was different. He made his own monument. He made it with his hips, as is evident from the great depth of the valley. That is the hard way.
All right, so let's turn now and enjoy this story. Some readers of the story who are freshmen will say it's almost like a child's story of a kind. And of course, it is kind of like a child's story. Now, let's point out at level 1, what is this really a text about? Well, it's really a story about a tall tale hero. Here, of course, we can already at 3A mention Odysseus.